There we go. All right, so now we'll kick off the recording. I paused it about 10 minutes before, and I was like, all right, I'm going to remember, and I didn't. So, Adina, thank you. Welcome, everybody. So, as I was saying, I actually started first as a writer. In the experience of putting together a book, it was just one question after question after question. So it was the editing stage, and I would look online, and someone was charging $150 for a whole book, and I was like, that doesn't seem right. I don't see how that's going to work. And so then I worked with my friends, and they did some feedback, and then I worked with a professional editor that also went through at the very end, and then it was time to navigate the publishing process. So all of that experience led me to say, okay, I didn't know what I was doing. I was learning along the way, and I want to provide as many resources as I can for other authors. And that led to the company Long Overdue. So we've got a few books. There's a Book of Monsters. We got Safe Landing that came out earlier this year. And then we've got the Martin Blackbriar book, which has the spine as the spine, which is kind of cool. So we've been at this for a couple of years, and one of the questions that I kept hearing from everybody was, what do I do once I got my first draft done? Like, do I just run it through Grammarly? How do I find an editor? Should I just ask my friends? And so there are all these questions that came up. And so I reached out, and we have an expert panel tonight. We have Adina Edelman and Jeanette Smith and Emily Price Soli joining us tonight. And so you came to see them. Most of the attendees, you probably know one or all three of these editors. So I'm going to pass the introductions over to them, and we'll actually start off with Emily.
All right. Hello, everyone. And thank you, Chris, for having me on this panel with Jeanette and Adina, two editors that I love and I'm actually really great friends with. So I'm a poetry and nonfiction editor. I specialize in titles related to spirituality, self-help, personal development, and memoir. And I also edit pretty much any and all kinds of poetry that you might throw at me. As for my editing background, I actually started writing short stories when I was about 5 years old. So I've been writing for pretty much my entire life. My first editing gig was in high school for my high school literary journal, which was called The Sampler. And then in college, I went to LSU. I was the managing editor of Legacy Magazine, and then I was a poetry editor for Delta Literary Journal. And then I founded my freelance business once I graduated college in August of, I won't reveal the year because, age and all of that stuff. When I went out of college, I founded my freelance business, and then I started freelancing full-time with a publisher called New Degree Press around that time for about 1.5 years or 2 years. And then last August in 2021, I started refocusing on my freelancing business and building my spirituality clientele. So, yeah, and I'm just happy to be able to serve creatives, entrepreneurs, thought leaders, and I work with incredible authors, incredible books, and I'm happy to do what I do.
All right, welcome, Emily. And next we will go to Jeanette.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Also equally happy to be here. This is just fantastic. I'm so excited. But my name's Jeanette. I have been a freelance editor and writer since 2017. Before that, I was a scuba diving instructor for 9 years. But I got a lot of marketing experience during that scuba instructing time, and that's led to the writing and the editing and everything like that. My very first book I ever edited was this book my sister wrote with her co-author. So she got published before me, which I'm very jealous about, but we're working on making that up sometime. So we'll see how that goes. In terms of editing, I do mainly copy editing, and I'm a big believer that copy editing does not have to be bound by genre. That, punctuation and what you're trying to say and how you're saying it can be very universal. So I work on almost every type of book, from fiction, nonfiction, memoir, short stories, really poetry, which Emily has got covered, I do not do. And then horror is kind of the only genre that I'm just not really into. So I probably wouldn't be the best at your book. But yeah, other than that, I've got LinkedIn, you can reach me at, or you can see me, around the internet. It's all good. So.
All right. Thank you, Jeanette. Any stories from being a scuba diving instructor that quickly come to mind, or too many to count?
Too many to count, but one of my favorite by far is Iceland. I got to dive in Iceland between two continents, and it was just probably the coolest thing I've ever done. So
Awesome. Oh, that's cool. And our third guest is Adina Edelman.
Hi, everyone. Also very excited to be here. I run Edelman Edits. I work with authors of memoir, self-help, and certain genres of fiction. I've edited over 70 books in the past 2.5 years, which is when I started my business. Many different genres and many different forms of editing. But right now I just stick to the memoir, self-help, and fiction. And I do offer developmental all the way through proofreading. And I have a BA in English and creative writing from Southern New Hampshire University. I interned with the Baltimore Review, which is a local literary journal, and I stayed on as a volunteer editor. And that was a very great experience in order to see what's publish worthy and just different voices and just the different styles that people write in. But I'm all about mining the message for gold and digging out the gold of an author's story and not just the little grammar issues. I'm very passionate about helping the message and the story of a book come out and not just slapping some editing on it. So I'm very excited to be talking about that with y'all here today.
Awesome. Any specific genres that you tend to work on or like to work on?
Besides from memoir, I tend to gravitate toward like medieval historical genres, but I mean, a lot of middle grade fiction as well, sci-fi, fantasy. I definitely, like Jeanette, stay very far away from horror. I don't do any romance. Yeah, and so I'm usually very particular about what I take on. Yeah.
Well, cool. So I thought we're going to start off with a few common editing questions just to kind of get things going. One that I've debated many times in my own writing is when to capitalize mom or dad. So if you're in a sentence and it's let's say Mark's mom, any input on when you would capitalize the M in mom and when you would leave it lowercase? Let's see, maybe Adina on this one.
Okay.
Or any volunteers.
Or it's all good. So one great tip, and I have to credit Emily on this because she had a great tip for this, is if you replace mom or dad with another name and it fits well to put that name in there. So, Craig and me went to the store, then, mom and me went to the store. But if it was my mom and I went shopping, then it would then be lowercase because you wouldn't say my Craig and I. So usually you would only capitalize it when it's a direct address. When you're saying, Mom, can we go to the store? To make it easier, since it's not beginning with sentence, can we go to the store, Mom? Then it would be capitalized.
I would also add that's true for like most nicknames of people. So if you have a nickname for someone, that would be capitalized in that case if you were direct address. However, terms of endearment, when you're calling someone darling or honey or something like that, those are not capitalized in general. So there's like exceptions to every rule. So I tend to bring up the exceptions because they're oftentimes more plentiful than the rules.
And how about if I'm saying Chris's mom, do I do apostrophe after Chris? Do I throw in another S?
I believe Chicago is apostrophe S.
Okay.
For yes, if there's an S at the end of a name. Yes.
Okay. And I promise this webinar won't just be my personal questions of my editing. So the second one is actually, Jeanette, I know you've posted a lot about this recently. You talk about commas a lot on your bio and your website. So any tips and tricks on a sentence with the word and in it, when to put a comma before and when to leave one out of the picture?
Sure. There's two main rules to know here. Now there's over 40 comma rules in the Chicago Manual of Style. So we're obviously not going to cover everything that could possibly come up with a comma and. But in general, if you have a independent clause, which is basically a sentence, subject verb, and an independent clause, subject verb, and you want to connect them, you would use a comma and an and. So you would have to have two complete sentences essentially that you are connecting. If they're not complete sentences, either the beginning or the end, then don't use that comma with your and. The other rule to know about and would be the serial comma, which most people know as the Oxford comma. So in a list of 3 or more, you would generally put a comma before the and of the last item in the list. This is a Chicago Manual of Style thing. I know AP Style says no. There's tons of style guides that will tell you differently. And there's always exceptions to the rule. For example, if you use the ampersand sign, so like the squiggly and sign, you would not use a comma before the and sign, the ampersand. So there's always exceptions to those rules, but in general, 2 sentences sticking together and any list of 3 or more.
I feel is that that's the mic drop on commas? Any Adina, Emily, anything else on that you notice or that you share with your authors?
I guess I'll just say in general, I'm pro Oxford comma, just throwing that hat into the ring. Because generally, if you try to forego the Oxford comma, you still have to use it sometimes to enhance readability. And you might have seen some examples of this where if you don't use the Oxford comma and things can the meaning can be a little confusing, or it could even come off as something you're not meaning for it to say. So I'm just pro Oxford comma, that serious comma, just because it's easier to maintain consistency throughout a manuscript. Again, other style guides disagree, but that's just my personal preference.
How do you pick a style guide for the project?
For almost all books, it's just Chicago inherently, unless there's a lot of research. You know, AP is the style guide for newspapers and magazines, and Chicago is the style guide for most nonfiction and fiction books that are published traditionally.
All right, we had one question come in from Blair Sharp, who was actually the first person to register for this webinar. I think that needs a shout out. Definitely made me feel better to see the first attendee. And she asks the best tip or trick to write in the active voice.
The trick of, if you're not sure if a construction is passive, like look for a by afterwards, like something by, and then the trick many people say is by zombies, right? So like, I was hit by zombies, right? You know, that's now in passive voice rather than the zombies hit me is active, right? So there's always tricks, but looking for that by or putting it in and seeing if it works can also tell you if you're more active or more passive.
This is the first I've heard of that trick. I kind of want to put some like animation to that when we get the recording, get the zombie kind of just crawling across the screen, and I think that'll be a good 1-minute tip. Okay, this question hit me during I was walking Crash, my dog, and I was halfway around the block. I was like, oh, I'm writing this down, and my phone died in that moment too, of course. And so I was like, okay, I got to really remember this one. And the question is, as an editor, would you rather receive a manuscript where you love the characters and you're connecting, you're like, these characters are amazing, but there's a typo, there's a mistake in every single sentence, maybe not every sentence, but every page, you're like, this is a lot, or the grammar is near perfect, but you're like, I'm not connecting with any of these characters and I'm bored out of my mind. What situation would you prefer to be in, or maybe what is less of a lift as an editor?
I have a lot of experience with both developmental editing and line and copy editing, so I have experienced this kind of situation. The difference between characters being good and grammar being good is a developmental issue versus a line or a copy editing issue. So when I receive a book and the characters are amazing, but the grammar is awful, then there's more motivation to work on it because, you know, the story is intact and there's something to fight for here. And the, you know, there's when there's good characters, then you can tell that the book is going to be intact and it's really going to carry through to the readers. And like editing, like grammar, like it's fine. I can deal with the grammar. If the characters are flawed, not in the good type of flaw, like they're not good characters, then it's back to the developmental editing stage, and or even to if they need a book coach and they just need to go back to, you know, to the basics of what makes a character good and developing the arc and making sure that they're realistic, then it doesn't matter that the grammar is perfect, all of their dialogue, all the descriptions of them. So it's almost pointless to have that perfect grammar if the characters aren't great.
Yeah, that reminds me, like in your newsletter, when you're talking about mining the message, it's like if the characters are really good, there's something there and you could work with that. And the other way, it's almost like you have to go back to square one and see, do you need new characters? Do you need to combine some of these characters into one? And, you know, it's probably a much heavier lift. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, any other thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I will say that whenever you go through a developmental edit, oftentimes you'll have to add or take out content. So if you spend a lot of extra energy during that stage, making the grammar perfect, making sure each word is right, you might end up just throwing all of that out anyway, whenever you go through a developmental edit. So I would always prefer to see those characters already intact, because editing kind of goes in stages, as we're going to talk about later. It progresses from the big picture. You want to solidify that first, make sure all the content is where it needs to be, and you're not going to be taking anything else out before you start focusing on the sentence level, because then you'll know you're actually expending the right amount of effort at the right time, and you're not doing extra work that you might not actually have to do if that content was just going to be removed anyway after a developmental edit.
I would just say in terms of that, it's kind of like, and I know Emily's going to draw this analogy later, but it's kind of like trying to put wallpaper on a falling down house, right? It's going to make it look pretty, but it's not going to structurally make it any better. So it's definitely a matter of get those characters, get that world building, get the plot solid, and then worry about that grammar.
Yeah. Which leads to this. I knew this question would kind of blend into this next one that's for Jeanette. The idea, so we're going to tackle some of the myths in editing, the common things that show up that authors may think, or first-time authors may be going through this for the first time and are unsure. And one thing that we wanted to address, Jeanette, is, okay, I'm working with an editor. I don't need to self-edit. All the editing is going to be the editor, right? That's how it works.
That is definitely how people want it to work, for sure. But if you have written a first draft, you've only put the first words on the paper, you have not reread it, you've not revised anything, you've not edited anything, you're probably not going to be ready for a professional editor. There's definitely steps to take to get things ready for an editor. I like to equate this to people who clean the house before the house cleaners come over. Right? You know, those people who do their own dishes and pick things up off the floor and wipe the counters down. And in the end, yes, those people seem silly on the surface, but what they're doing is they're allowing that cleaning service to come and do a deeper clean. They're going to get that. They're going to have time to wipe the fan blades. They're going to have time to scrub the sink. They're going to have time to do all these things that you as a person wouldn't do to your own home or just don't have time to. So same thing for an editor. When you get a book ready for an editor, you want to take it to the very limits of your knowledge so that the editor can look deeper at the text. This is going to give you a little more bang for your buck, for sure. It might even get you a lower price on editing. I know many editors, me included, will judge the price of a project based on how much that project needs. So if we see a misspelling every 3 words that could have been caught by a spell check, we're going to probably give you a higher price because we know we have to fix all of of that, and it's going to take longer. It could potentially make your edit longer, so that the editor has to spend more time with your manuscript. And then there is a certain amount of like pride of place, right? Like being able to say like, I did as much as I could to this versus just, oh, I banged it out and now it's your problem. So there's definitely, the reasons why to self-edit before you hand it to an editor. The only thing I would add is kind of how to do that or what to do, which I could spend an entire webinar talking about. But to boil it down, there was this other editor in a Facebook group, and I don't know who it was, so I wish I could give credit, but they talked about the idea of editing being boulders, rocks, and sand. The boulders are the obvious mistakes. Those are the spell check things. Those are the plot holes where, you put your character with brown hair for the first half of the book and then made him blonde for the second half of the book, something like that. Something that's really easy for you to fix on your own. You can take care of those boulders and whittle them down into just rocks so that the editor can really take a look at those rocks, the maybe more finer details, and then kind of translate that all down into the sand where we can look at just the minutia of your manuscript. So definitely a good idea to take your manuscript as far as possible to the limits of your knowledge before you hand that to an editor, because you're just going to get so much more out of it.
And how do you evaluate the manuscript? I mean, how many pages do you look at before you kind of give a quote or an idea of what it's going to be?
I usually ask for 30 pages so I can read through. And one of the reasons I do this is that many editors will offer test edits of, 10, 15, 20 pages. So I try and make sure that I get at least 30 to 40 to 50 pages so that way, if they have had the first few pages test edited, I can still see, what the raw manuscript looks like. So I tend to ask for a large chunk so that I can really evaluate overall how you're doing. I also find people tend to get better towards the end of their books, right? Like you've spent all this time writing, you just get better by the end. So I find that as people go through and I go through their novels or their books, that it just gets easier at the end because they did so much better. So definitely looking at a larger chunk is helpful.
Yeah, I noticed that with a novel that I wrote. The chapters toward the end, I was like, oh, there's a lot going on in here. Like there's layers, and some of those first chapters, like, oh boy, this was the one that was written 8 years ago, not the one 8 weeks ago. Adina and Emily, how about your process with sample edits or sample reads?
Yeah, I always do a sample edit before taking on a project. Sorry, Emily. Jeanette, that is genius to ask for 30 pages. I don't know why I don't do that. I usually ask for 20, and then that helps me whether it's going to see if it needs a developmental edit or a line edit, and just get a feel for the writing and the pacing and the style. But yeah, always do a sample edit. It helps them see my editing style. It helps me see where their writing is at, how long it's going to take me, and then give them an accurate quote. So yeah, I definitely advocate doing that.
And how about you, Emily?
Well, I usually actually try to get the full manuscript before I say so. And this kind of depends on if I'm doing like a sentence level line edit or developmental edit. Because if I'm doing a manuscript evaluation, I'm going to kind of want to read the entire thing first, just to make sure that is indeed the service that it needs. But if it's a sentence level edit, like a line edit, I can usually find out in about the first 20 pages if that is indeed the service that it needs. And then when it comes to a sample edit, I'll usually sample edit about 1,000 words to give them a feel for what my style kind of looks like. For manuscript evaluations, the sample editing is a little more difficult because you're kind of looking at the big picture of the book, and you won't exactly know what kind of feedback you have until you've read the entire thing. So when it comes to a sample edit for a manuscript evaluation, I'll try to just give 1 or 2 pieces of overall feedback that I saw in my brief read at first, to kind of give them a sense for what direction that I could see their book going in. But yeah, I try to get the full manuscript, and if not, then I try to at least get the first chapter, the last one, and one in the middle, because like you said, it kind of just, sometimes there's what's called throat clearing at the beginning of the book, where the author is just like getting it out, getting used to their own voice. And then by the end, it's great. and or they worked on the first chapter super, super hard and for a long time, and then the style and the quality kind of deteriorates as the book goes on. So I try to get the full manuscript if I can, but I never want to make an author do that if they don't feel comfortable. And so that's when I ask for just the 3 chapters throughout the book.
Makes sense. And we have a few more questions that came in, and so I do plan on getting to those. But next question that I had was for Adina, and so it's all you see in Hollywood and that you read in fiction is factually correct. There's no mistakes. It's all factually correct. So I was curious your thoughts on that, and specifically kind of how to build awareness of truth, and research it and represent it well.
Yeah, I'll start off with an anecdote as to why I want to talk about this and I feel passionate about it. I'm currently working on a book in which the main character suffers from physical head trauma, forgets his entire past and who he is, and then has to deal with that conflict for the rest of the book until he bangs his head again and then remembers everything, which is a great resolution.
Oh, nice.
So my first thought when I saw this was, here's another classic amnesia trope, which is kind of overdone by this point, but it also struck me as very unrealistic. And so I went off and did a whole bunch of research on retrograde amnesia, which is basically where someone has physical head trauma, and then often they'll forget events leading up to the incident. But they most certainly usually will be able to remember their childhood, and they will always be able to remember their identity. The side note, the only time when someone would forget or be unable to know who they are, that would be caused by emotional trauma, and I have physical head trauma. So that's just a good thing to know, be aware of. But I had put out this finding as a post recently, and there were a few people who were also saying, oh, I didn't know this, because it's sort of fed to us through movies and through a lot of books that this is what happens and this is normal. And when someone, falls unconscious and then they could just get up and then it's normal, and a lot of other medical things that are just misrepresented a lot. And across so many fields, you can find it in scuba diving, you can find it in rock climbing, a lot of physical. The first off, just knowing it's important to represent these things accurately. Just because you're writing fiction doesn't mean that it shouldn't be realistic. That's what allows the readers to connect to the story and learn from it. I know that I definitely learned a lot of great information from fiction books, but also recognizing that I have to be aware that some things that I've learned from that hasn't been factually correct. And so when you sit down and you write something that you are not personally experienced in, that's when you need to be questioning the information that you've taken in from entertainment sources, as opposed to, the experts who have shared their knowledge. So if your main character is an accountant and you know nothing about accounting, then what are you going to do? You usually have 2 options. One is to find an accountant, but hopefully most people have one, and you can ask him questions. Or, it's so easy to go on LinkedIn and connect with people in so many different occupations and just say, hey, I'm writing this and I was just curious about this. Do you have time to answer a couple questions? Most people will be willing. If they don't have time, they will let you know right away. But that's why it's really good to build your network of people in different occupations and just different expertise in different areas of knowledge, so that when you want to write about that, you know whom to ask. And another thing is just researching on your own. A lot of people will turn to Google, and you could find pretty well researched material on there to go by. One example is I was once writing a story where I had to talk about forging weapons. So I actually went on YouTube, and there are channels on there of people who know what they're doing and teach the process, and you can see it happening, which makes it much easier to write about. So, just part of that research is finding the people who know what they're talking about, who you can sort of trust, and then be able to write about it. I once heard a historical fiction writer say that she never trusted novels as her research for 2 reasons. One, because she wasn't sure if the author did their research properly. And the other is that she doesn't know if they purposely presented it in a modernized way or just through a bias or something. It could have been twisted a little bit. And so, she wanted to go back to the actual sources and be able to give over information accurately. So it's important to question your assumptions when you're sitting down and writing something, and just be aware that there are a lot of things out there that aren't necessarily true. And, just do your part to take responsibility for your work and be able to research it well.
Yeah, I think the LinkedIn point is a really good one. I've been amazed at how people will reply that you would think just like wouldn't give me the time of day. Like I reached out to a surgeon once and I was like, can I just like know what a day in the life is? Because I was like, otherwise I'm just gonna like watch Doctor Strange and make that like my idea of the surgeon's life, and that's just how like that's all I have. And he wrote this awesome. He wrote almost an article, a blog post, kind of hour by hour, and I was like,
Wow.
Who knew that I could just reach out and do that? And another thing, one of my creative writing professors taught is authors that are just starting at age 50 or 60 or 65 plus, they actually have an advantage because of all the life experience. They can be like, oh, I know what it's like to write as a 40-year-old, and I know what it's like to be a 30-year-old. Whereas someone at 22 right out of college is at best kind of drawing from movies or drawing from their parents and trying to guess what it's like to be 40, 50 years old. And I definitely seen that being true. Is first-time authors, they're not as far behind as they might think because they've got more experience to pull from, which is really cool. And then one more, because I know we're coming up on time a little bit with the Q&A. I want to make sure we have time for developmental and line and copy editing. So one more myth for Emily is this dynamic where an author might be like, you know what, the editor's out to get me. They're just going to tear my book apart. It's not going to be a partnership. Could you address that idea of moving away from this, like the editor versus the author, to these two are working together on the book?
Absolutely. I'm really excited to talk about this because this is a thing that I've heard a lot of authors express trouble about, because most of their experience with the red pen is with like high school teachers, middle school teachers who just tore something up with no regard to them. And so I understand why that feeling comes up a lot. And so when it comes to the editor-author partnership, the most important thing that I want authors to look for is for an editor that they can trust, and for an editor whose feedback that they can be receptive to. And so that kind of brings up the question, how do you know you can trust an editor? There are some obvious answers. You want to look at their resume, see what their credentials are, their training, if they've worked on projects that are similar to yours. But you also want to get a sense for their working style and their feedback style. So you can do that by asking them simply, so here's the service you're saying that I need. What does that look like? What are you going to deliver to me? What am I actually going to get out of this for the money that I'm paying? And as we discussed earlier, when it comes to the feedback style, you might want to ask for a sample edit to see if you resonate with the kinds of comments that they receive or that the editor gives, things like that. And the most important thing that I think, more than any of this, is to find an editor who isn't trying to make your book into something that they want it to be, which most professional editors know this, not to step on an author's voice, but there are editors out there who are kind of looking to mold others' projects into something that they kind of think is right. And so Jeanette already touched on kind of the house example, which I think is the perfect example for this. So I imagine that the writer has built the foundation of this home, they've built the walls, installed the plumbing, done the painting, done all the decorating, the author has done all of the work. And so the editor's job is not to come in and to just like point at a wall and say, okay, let's tear this wall down. I don't like this. This wall just doesn't look good here. Open floor plans are better. And their job isn't to walk into a minimally designed home and to say, let's throw some zebra stripes over here and some hot pink paint over here, As an editor, my job is not that. It's not to do what I think is best. It's to try to ensure that the book that you've written is serving your vision, and to ensure that the readers who are going to be coming into your house, or the visitors who are going to be coming into your house, can enjoy it, can feel comfortable, and are going to have a good time experiencing it. So this doesn't mean that your editor is never going to tell you to make large scale changes. You know, some editors will suggest a big rewrite, maybe an entirely new point of view, a new structure, but it should always be in service of your message and what you want your readers to come away with. And if you sit with that feedback for 2 days, 3 days, weeks, however long you have to sit with it, and you realize they're right, or at least you can live with the kind of feedback they're suggesting, you know you have a good editor partnership. If after that time, or whenever you get the sample edit, you just don't resonate with what they're saying, even after sitting with their feedback, you know that's probably not the best editor for you.
And how about the experience when the book is finished and you see the copy? Is it almost like you wrote it, or like what's that experience like as the editor to be like, this is my book?
Yeah, I do have the feeling it's my book because I get so proud of it, but I never actually feel that way. Adina was just saying this today in our co-working group, and that sometimes like we have these feelings about what we want these books to look like, but at the end of the day, they're not our books. The hard part is the writing. In comparison to the writing, the editing is easy because we're seeing a finished product and we're getting to just build upon it with the knowledge that we already have. So yes, I get excited. I'm like, oh, this is my baby. This is my book. But I never fool myself into thinking that this was really, I put in more effort than I actually did to make this book what it was. You know, that's different if I did some ghostwriting. If I did some ghostwriting, then sure, I'll be like, yes, this is also my baby too. I worked on this as well. But with just editing, no, it's the author's book first.
Yeah. Jeanette and Adina, any thoughts on that? Seeing the final book?
I mean, it's like such a nice experience to be able to physically hold something that you've spent so long working on in an intangible form. So it's very validating, and it's just very exciting. I think a lot of us who are writers, and we went to the library as kids and we're like, oh, we want to see our books on shelves. And even and now, even if we aren't the author, it's still like I took a part in this physical shape that is here, and that is very rewarding. It's very exciting.
Yeah, I would just say it's all about the author in the end, right? Like it's not my dream to publish their book, it's their dream to publish their book. I'm just helping them get to that dream. So when I hold it physically in my hands, yes, it's my accomplishment, but really it's theirs. And that's what's so important, is just like that I'm so happy for them as a person. I'm just like, oh my gosh, they're published, so it's not like I'm published, it's like they're published. Right. So it just makes me happy for sure. But I collect all of them, every copy.
Yep, definitely. I'm so proud of ours, all the ones that we've worked on. Okay, so developmental editing, we've talked about it a little bit. And so I guess this would be for Adina. What is developmental editing, and what's covered during that stage?
Okay, so the developmental edit is a big picture edit. When it takes place is a little bit of a gray area. Some people will say, oh, you have part of the book and you need help developing it, then I'll step in and help. I personally look at it as you have a complete manuscript and now you need a developmental editor to read through it and look at the big picture things to see what needs work. That includes structure. It includes point of view, vision of the house, that if those are not working well, then it's going to be much harder to fix up the later points, and you need to address the big stuff first. So often when I do a developmental edit, so I'll go through it in 2 passes. The first will just be reading through it to get an idea. Sometimes I'll jot down some comments of initial reactions, but then I'll always go through it a second time with the full knowledge of what this book is. And I'll do my in-text comments outlining, the character started here and then ended up as a totally, inconsistent character at the end. How do you want to connect that? And often a developmental edit is accompanied by an editorial letter, which outlines, many edits have this letter, and it outlines the strengths and suggested improvements. And I usually say that the developmental edit takes the most out of the writer because they have to do the most revisions, whereas the line editing usually takes the most out of the editor because of all the little details that they need to do.
then what about, so we'll have copy editing and line editing to go over. Jeanette or Emily, any preference on which one you want? Who wants which?
I can go for line editing because
All
it's
right.
actually my favorite service, because I'm also a poetry editor, so I really love just the musicality of language. And so that's kind of what line editing is focusing on. I won't get too much into copy editing, but where copy editing is error focused, line editing is more focused on the musicality of prose and the flow of prose. So you're looking if too many kinds of one kind of sentence are repeated, making things feel monotonous. You're looking at if a reader might trip over too many of one syllable words in a row. You're
Mhm.
looking at really how things are flowing together and how the reader's experience is going to be. And it's a bit, I call it one of the more artful forms of editing, because you're actually getting in there in the weeds and you're not just correcting errors. You're not just looking for something to fulfill what you would normally want to be in a certain genre of book. You're actually getting in there, and it's very active process for the editor to kind of see, okay, where are things flowing well together? Where could a transition be strengthened to lead a reader from one idea to the next? Those kinds of things.
Nice. And Jeanette, what about copy editing?
Yeah, so copy editing is going to be one of your final stages right before proofreading. So copy editing is basically you've got the plot down, the characters are strong, the world is there, you've got the words down on the page that you want on the page, and then the copy editor comes along and just adds a little bit of punctuation and grammar magic to it. So I agree with Emily, it is very error focused in many ways, but there are different levels of copy editing. So for example, a heavy copy edit would include some instances of line editing where you look at, oh, you've started these 3 sentences in a row in the same way, let's change one of them. Or, so there's different levels of copy editing, but at its most basic form, it's grammar and punctuation, which is kind of like putting the makeup on the final product, right? So it's fun. It's my favorite part for sure, because I just like, it's that way of making the person's writing sing. It's taking the words that they wrote and using the punctuation and the form to really get it across properly. And I just think that there's magic in that. So I love the copy editing stage.
So developmental's first, and then line usually next, and then copy is and then what is so proofreading, what's covered in that is I assume the final stage.
Yeah, final stage for sure. Proofreading, in my understanding, and I'm not a proofreader, but generally you want the proofread to happen in your formatted pages. So a proofreader is going to take the final look of the book where it's formatted in InDesign or whatever you might format it in, and they're going to compare it to the raw text, and they're going to say, okay, did everything transfer properly? Did we skip a sentence or a paragraph somewhere? Are there line breaks where there shouldn't be line breaks? Are there widows or orphans in the text that we need to fix? And then, of course, catching just any sort of final misspellings, any sort of final, like, they don't do a lot of punctuation unless it's really obvious, like it's a period missing at the end of a sentence. They generally don't touch a lot of commas, but it's kind of that final, like, let's just get the final eyes on it process.
Yep, and we'll have
Yeah.
we'll do a book design webinar in the future, but the widows and orphan term, that's when there's one word that is the whole paragraph on either the end or the top of a page. Is that kind of okay?
Yeah.
Well, great. Any other thoughts on proofreading before we dive into the Q&A?
I will add, just to further clarify, because people don't always understand the difference between proofreading and other forms of editing. But like Jeanette said, you're not changing very much at the proofread level. If there is a sentence that's unclear, then it's like, we're just going to leave it. At that point, you really, like, it's not the time to be touching that. And if there's a word missing, okay, then we'll add that in. But if something is technically correct, but you're like, oh, I don't like the way that sounds, That's not what a proofread is for. That would be back to line edit or copy edit stage. And proofreading also, you want to look over the table of contents to make sure that all the pages are matching up correctly. It's rare to find an error, but when you do find one, it's very satisfying. And yeah, all the front matter that comes before it, the foreword and acknowledgements if it's at the beginning of the book, and then the back matter with the glossary and index and that kind of stuff, depending what kind of book it is. But the proofreader is going to look through all of that, and there are so many little things to try to catch in a proofread. So even though it's much lighter in terms of work than, let's say, a line edit or a copy edit, it still requires a lot of attention to detail because of all the things that you need to be on guard for.
I once in my book, I used a location in Michigan, and I described it as being on I think the index finger instead of the ring finger. And it was a total mistake. I don't know how, I don't know what I was thinking. I guess I was looking at the hand the wrong way with Michigan. But so what stage would that have been caught in line or proofreading?
I mean, a copy edit is more for like the fact checking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of editors actually do line editing and copy editing together. That's what I try to do. It can actually be, it's kind of a big effort, because you have to kind of keep track of the style guide and all the corrections at the same time as you're keeping track of flow. But a lot of times those two stages are done together just because they're both very sentence focused. And so that would have been something I would have flagged in DE, line editing, or copy editing, any one of those stages, if I would have noticed an error like that.
And for anyone unfamiliar with Michigan, we're very proud of how we can point to locations on a band. That's our go-to move. And I blotched it. I completely botched it. So we've got a few questions. One of these, one that stood out to me is, okay, if you're a newbie to this world, first book, never worked with an editor before, and you go ahead and you do your self-edit, how do you go about getting a quote from an editor?
So I was seeing that question in the Q&A as well. I think it depends a lot on what type of publishing you're looking for. So if you're looking for a professional publisher and an agent, you're gonna maybe pay for a couple of stages of professional editing, possibly a developmental edit, possibly even a line edit. But once you get into an agency and an agent, and then you get into a publisher, oftentimes they will take over the later stages of line editing, copy editing, right? So you want to get it as far as possible for them. Now, if you're self-publishing, you would want to go through all the stages. So in that case, you would find an editor who jives with the type of editing that you want to go for. A lot of it is kind of, you want to like date your editor, right? You want to make sure personality wise you match. You want to make sure they understand your goals. They want to make sure that they just kind of have the time frame that you're looking at, that they have the capacity, that they're within your budget. There's a lot of factors to consider when reaching out to an editor, but there's no harm in reaching out. Like, there is no harm. We're all available by email or LinkedIn message or whatever it is. Just say, hey, here's where I'm at. What do I do? Are you the person for me? And if we're not, we're going to direct you somewhere else. And we're helpful like that.
And if they've never written a book before, that's not really a factor in your evaluation. You're fine. First time author.
Nope, not at all. Everybody's a first timer at some point, right?
Yep. Let's see. This one I thought was interesting. Struggling to place a book in a single genre. I know this is important if I'm going the traditional route. So would an editor give specific suggestions for things that could be done to help make the book more marketable? So is marketability of a book, is that something editors give suggestions on?
Yeah, that's something that would be addressed during the developmental or manuscript evaluation stage. So if you're looking to go the traditional route, typically, if you already have a pretty clean manuscript, you'll be looking for a manuscript evaluation first. And the difference between that and a developmental edit, according to most editors, all of our definitions are kind of mixed up depending on who you're talking to. But a developmental edit really gets into a book, leaves a lot of comments on the manuscript itself, is really guiding the author on a very sentence by sentence basis as to how to implement these changes. But a manuscript revision letter or a manuscript evaluation involves a revision letter where they're going to say what the marketability of the book is, what you could do to make it more marketable, in addition to some big picture changes that you could actually make yourself in order to be able to sell that book to a publisher or to pitch that book to an agent. But whenever you're actually pitching to an agent or publisher, there's some other considerations like writing your query letter, ensuring that you have a platform, which has become increasingly more important as publishing has become more and more corporate. So there are kind of more considerations than just how the book's looking. It's also how well can you market the book. And so if you're looking to go the traditional route, I would specifically seek out an editor who has experience with that route. Like for me, I've worked with mostly self-publishing authors so far. So you'd want to find an editor who's worked and who has succeeded in selling or helping authors sell their book to a publisher or finding an agent if you want to go that route.
Changing it up a little bit, how do you uncover the gold in a story after writing a first draft? I assume this is for the writer going back through their book. As the editor, would you recommend a full rewrite of a manuscript that needs developmental work, or would it just be intensive editing and you'd really work with them chapter by chapter? At what point would you say let's do that versus, hey, let's maybe rewrite this and then come back?
That's a hard call. And I think you first need to see what's working. And if there's enough there that's working to, keep it and then rework the parts around it, or if the very essence of the book is not working, and then you need to sort of go back to square one. Usually there are book coaches that I think are more geared to this than editors. I'm sure there are developmental editors that do work with this, but it does seem more for a book coach to be able to, go through chapter by chapter and look at that with you. But it's going to be like a case by case scenario of what's there. And I think if you just, if you find one of those questionnaires of like, is there character development? Does the plot have, have the inciting incident, and is there a resolution? Like all those questions to check yourself, and then just see what is there that is working and what needs improvement. And does the stuff that needs improvement, is it like, oh, I just need to add a few extra scenes or rewrite some scenes, or is there like, there's this massive plot hole that just is refusing to be filled, and so I really need to change something. So it's definitely going to, depend on the thing. And if you get stuck, I would definitely reach out to a book coach to, get that objective feedback on that.
I want to mix it up. We're going back to a question less about the process of editing and more on the page. So this question is, a character starts speaking in a paragraph and pauses, and then the action continues, and then we come back to that person speaking again. Do you prefer to say, Chris continued, or Chris continued speaking? How do you bridge that back when there's a gap between the dialogue?
I think part of that's going to be your formatting on the page, to be honest, because if a character has a line of dialogue and then you have some sort of descriptor sentence and then another line of dialogue from that same character, you might have them all in one paragraph. You wouldn't necessarily put that second line of dialogue on its own line. So I think that can indicate to a reader necessarily who is speaking. You could also add, like, whatever the quote was, and then Chris said, and then your sentence where Chris does something, and then the next one Chris said, or there's so many ways you can go about it. But I think some part of your formatting might also indicate to the reader who is speaking again.
I would also, not as a rule, but just see why you're using the word continued or continued speaking, because often that's telling when you could just go into the dialogue and just show them that, oh, now he's speaking again. Sometimes you can transition it with an action beat, which is just a short description of an action they're doing to indicate who's speaking. But often when I see, he continued speaking, it's not usually needed. Again, not always, not like as a rule of thumb, but that's just something to consider.
Let's see, oh yeah, so does a book need to go through all of the stages? Does it depend on the author's budget or the state of the book? Do some authors only do a couple of those services versus do they sign up for all of them?
Especially in the self-publishing climate now, you get to kind of choose which services you're going to have done. So that puts the ball kind of in the court of the author, which for the industry is a little scary. And for authors in general who have to do all this research is very scary. But you really it comes back to the trust in the author-editor partnership. So if you find an editor who reviews your manuscript and tells you what would be best for you to have, if you trust this person, their expertise or testimonials, then you should listen to them. Those are probably the services you're going to need. But if budget is a factor, I always say the most important round of editing you need to have is copy editing, because that's going to address all the errors that are the easiest for readers to see. Those grammar mistakes, those punctuation mistakes. So if you don't have the budget for anything else, despite what your editor tells you you need, go ahead and have copy editing done. And then a second thing that I think is just as important is proofreading, because same thing, if page numbers are wrong from the table of contents, if there's some small typos that have been missed, those are the things that are going to kind of put your reader off faster than anything else. Obviously, you want your structure intact and all of that, but those kinds of editing, tends to be more expensive because there's a lot, it involves a lot more of the editor's time to get all that completed. So if you have no budget for anything else, I always recommend copy editing and proofreading as the top ones, but definitely just defer to your editor's judgment. And look to a lot of different editors, get a lot of different opinions. You don't have to just talk to one or two and then settle down with one or two of those people. You can just keep asking questions, sending parts of your manuscript off to others for other sample edits. Find an editor who works for you in terms of what you're looking for price-wise, service-wise, in order for you to publish your book.
I'd also say don't be scared to reach out to multiple editors, because while many editors do all the types of editing, they won't necessarily do every type of editing on the same book. So for example, I will not, even though I don't proofread, I would never proofread a same book that I copy edited, because I've gone through it too many times. I've seen it too many times. My eyes are going to read over things. I'm not going to be as detailed as somebody who's never seen the text before. So don't be scared of having multiple editors on your team who are specialized in the different types of editing, because they're going to be able to bring different things to the table.
It sounds like a lot of times editors are very collaborative with each other, and they're like, that's my book, and you can't help out. It seems like, and it seems like if someone comes to you, Jeanette, and they've got the horror book and they're like, I need you to edit this, and you're like, that's not what I do. You may have someone in mind and say, but this editor would be good. Does that happens a good amount?
Absolutely. We're a big community. LinkedIn, we've got groups going on Discords and Slack channels. I mean, we're all connected. I don't consider other editors my competition. I consider them my colleagues. And I think that's a big standard in the industry that people believe.
100%. I get so excited when I get to refer a project to other people, because that just creates opportunities for newer editors, for editors who need projects. Like I genuinely get excited to share projects that I can't take on. So 100% collaborative. I love this community so much.
It also feels really good to be able to refer someone to that author who, instead of just saying, oh, I don't have anyone for you, good luck, instead of saying, oh no, here's 3 awesome people who you should reach out to. And then that's also a good feeling.
Yeah, which I think that kind of covers one of the questions that Donna had for Adina. If something's not a fit, how do you let them know? And it sounds like you try to refer them if you can.
Yeah, I mean, if it's not a fit because there's content in there that I'm sensitive to, that I don't want to deal with, it's much easier because then I could just say, I don't work with this content, done deal, and then there's nothing to talk about. It's when the writing isn't good that I sort of struggle with what to say because, like sometimes I'll be able to say, I would suggest reaching out to a book coach, and sometimes I'll just say, I don't think I'm the right fit for you, try reaching out to this person. But I can't say, I don't work with memoir, or I don't line edit memoir, because that's not true. It's just this particular book is not gonna work.
Yeah.
So that's when it gets hard.
And then last question, because I know we're a little bit over 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. This is from Tony. So from the book designer perspective, a lot of books will come to her, and they weren't aware of the proofreading stage. And so she's wondering, do you include a final proofread of the formatted book in your estimate, or is that an additional charge? Or is that, again, someone you might refer as the proofreader?
Yeah. So that's a simple answer. It's almost always an additional charge, especially if you're not aware that you're going to be doing that from the start. But yeah, I always try to, whenever I can, to kind of walk authors through the process, especially self-publishing authors, because there are so many steps. Getting the ISBN, getting your editing, getting your layout, getting your cover, understanding the self-publishing process in general, Amazon, Ingram, Kobo, like there's a lot to learn. So as I'm editing their book and after I submit it to them, I try to kind of tell them, here are some things that you're going to want to consider going forward. And then I just kind of leave it in their court as to whether or not they're going to do that. So I can suggest these things, but again, at the end of the day, for a self-publishing author, they get to decide which ones they're going to do. All I can do is suggest. So Tony, I do my best to try to get them a proofread. And yes, it is an additional charge. Usually, this is very much a ballpark amount, but it's about a third of the cost of the copy edit usually. When I've worked on the book previously, it's usually about a third of the cost. I try to make it as cost effective as possible since I've read the book before.
Yeah, I would say one thought from my experience was a feedback circle after the first draft helped a lot. And so I just picked 4 or 5 friends to read through the book. I came up with some questions, and we're starting to do that with our authors now too. And so it's the first time that someone else is joining your book, and there's a lot that you can uncover just in that stage. So that can be a helpful step to do prior to an editor, where it's going to help you get a little bit further and decrease the amount of time on editing, and you might spot some things, especially at the developmental level, that you might not have seen on your own. So that's, let's see, I think we've got a couple types of, yeah, okay, so I think we'll wrap this up. If anybody has questions that come up 5 minutes after this, or we didn't address it, feel free to email me, chris@longoverduebooks.com. Also on LinkedIn, Chris O'Brien. I'm happy to answer these questions or send them over to our panelists and get some help. To close, I was thinking each one to share again where people can find you, how they can get in contact, or how they can submit work to you as well. So let's kick off with Emily.
All right, so I'm most active on LinkedIn. So if you search Emily Price Soli, you'll find me on LinkedIn. My business is called The Present Page Editorial Services. That kind of speaks to how important mindfulness is to me and compassion in my editorial style. So my website is thepresentpage.com, and my email is thepresentpage@gmail.com. And I would love to talk to you, even if we don't work together. Like we've said, this is a super collaborative community. We can find you someone who can work with you. I can kind of tell you what next steps are going to look like, whatever that may be for you. And I would love to have the opportunity to do that.
Great. Jeanette?
Yeah, so you can find me also on LinkedIn. I post most days of the week. And so it's just Jeanette Smith. And it's that picture of me laughing. So, because I know there's a lot of Smiths. You also, I go by Jeanette the Writer. That's kind of my moniker for my fiction and some of my content writing. So JeanetteTheWriter.com. or Jeanette@JeanetteTheWriter.com. You can email me, you can get on my website, my email's there. But I'm happy to talk to people. I'm happy to counsel people through, helping them figure out what stage they're at. There's no stupid questions in writing and editing. There's only a question you don't have answered. So don't feel afraid to ask that.
And Adina.
I'm also on LinkedIn. You can search in my name. I haven't tried this, but I might be the only Adina Edelman on there. And my website is edelmanedits.com and email is adina@edelmanedits.com.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for everybody that joined and participated tonight. These were great questions. I can't reiterate that enough. There's no shame in being a first-time author. That's first time through a first draft. It's worth doing. It's worth going on to the editing stage, working with great editors. You have 3 of them right here. So reach out to them, reach out to us at longoverduebooks.com. And we can't wait to hear about the books that you're working on. And you know what? Have a great night. Have a great rest of the week. And thanks again to Adina and Emily and Jeanette for joining us.
Thanks so much, Chris.
All right.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks,
All right.
everybody.
See you, everybody.
Thank you.